Hello class, this video lecture will cover Daytripper chapters 6 and 7. As always, here's a brief review of the themes to look for while reading. Centrally is the theme of family, in particular the role fathers and sons play in developing a sense of family for an individual. We have the role of nature, providing a contrast to city life, including Moon and Ba's use of the pastoral as a key genre and style of their work. We obviously have death. Death will become a central focus of these two chapters. And finally, the notion of truth. The point being that absolute truth cannot be found in grand narratives, but can only be found by focusing on particular and important moments that can be valuable in and of themselves. Chapter 6 focuses on the plane crash and the traumatic responses both Jorge and Brás have in relation to this. Trauma is a key theme of these two chapters and connects to the understanding of death and a positive way to understand death that allows for healing and moving on from trauma, and a negative response to death that only develops into a spiral of self-destruction. These two chapters are heavily important in the development of trauma and the notion of death. Some context. TAM Airlines Flight 3054 is the deadliest aviation accident in Brazilian history. On July 2007, the plane overshot the runway at Sao Paulo Airport and crashed into a nearby warehouse and gas station. All 181 passengers and 6 crew members on board were killed, along with the 12 people on the ground. In a different context, this is the real history of Brazil that Moon and Ba are drawing on in the plane crash that we see in chapter 6. Right? As you see, it's very similar. We have the fire, we have the explosions. This is very much an evocative moment of that plane crash in Brazilian history. So, this plane crash is a tragedy that forces our main characters into a situation where they are traumatized and have to deal with the death and tragedy that they see. Jorge will fade into nihilism and despair and and understand that life means nothing. He will see that he has no family, nothing worth living, and only sees the death and trauma of the event. Brás, although also traumatized, will come out of this spiral and use this as a moment of truth and do an empathetic turn towards helping others as a way to cope and develop a means of moving past his trauma. So, a fundamental question about how we define trauma is by reviewing the difference between direct and indirect trauma and the exposure that has for post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, neither of direct and indirect should be considered on a hierarchy of importance. The concept does not work that way. Instead, we should see these as two ways a person can be exposed to a traumatic event. Direct exposure includes experiencing a trauma firsthand or witnessing the trauma as it occurs to others. Sort of you see it with your own eyes or you experience it. Indirect exposure to trauma may occur by learning about the violent or accidental death of a close relative, or learning about a traumatic event through secondary narrative accounts, such as media or the news. So we have two ways of understanding trauma. One directly, something that someone experiences or witnesses firsthand, and indirectly, a method where somebody hears about it secondhand or through the information presented to you by a mediator, whether that be the media or another person. So Brás has direct exposure to this trauma. Brás experiences it directly when he is sent to cover the crash for the newspaper. Even though he was not totally connected to it, in that he does not have a family member or loved one or knows anyone that was on the crash and who has died. If you remember, Jorge is not on the plane. he is definitely witnessing a direct exposure to the trauma. All right, we see his face here. We see in the panel presented, we see the how wide his eyes are, and Moon and Ba are trying to give you a sense of what Brás would be feeling. You know, the heat, the panic, the smell. Brás' initial reaction to this trauma is to focus on the fragility of life. He states that all of the important structures of life, all of the sort of ways that we try to protect ourselves from trauma and tragedy are fragile. What he means by this is that at any moment, this veneer and shield of safety could be split. His reaction to understanding that his life is fragile, where a moment of trauma could happen at any point, becomes a bit of an obsession to him. When he understands that, as he says, when he thinks about how something could go wrong, he can't think of anything else. He's focused on the event of the plane crash, and he's thinking about how that accident could happen at any time, at any moment. And we see his focus on this as when he almost hits the people by stopping really quickly at the red light. Both Brás and Jorge's reaction to the traumatic experience of the plane crash does leave them with PTSD symptoms. Right? If you notice in these two panels presented here, Brás has this feeling of worry. He's not just worried about his friend, he feels that he is a fraud, that his ability to write about these people's deaths in the obituaries, to kind of encapsulate them, is unfounded, that he cannot do it. For Moon and Ba, this is a key part about how one reacts to trauma. In other words, the post-traumatic stress situation is in some respects unavoidable, and now we are going to see how Brás and Jorge attempt to heal and move past this sense of trauma. For Brás, Moon and Ba suggest that healing from trauma can happen when one develops an empathetic approach that turns outward, that looks to the other people around their lives, and tries to find a sense of purpose in community and other people. Brás eventually, as we see, will find solace in his attempt to help others. But it is Anna in chapter 6 that teaches him this lesson. She tells him that every new obituary Brás writes brings one doubt to rest and sets one family at peace. She tells Brás that this writing is important because the families need this sense of closure. So we have an example here presented to us by our authors, Moon and Ba, of how healing from trauma can work. For them, they suggest this healing can be found in solace in other people. You look to those around you, you see how you can help them, and they in turn will help you. Brás must turn towards Anna and turn towards the people that he's writing the obituaries to, and this will help him move through his own traumatic exposure to the accident. Jorge, however, takes the opposite approach. Jorge turns his focus of someone who might have been on the plane, even though he only hears about it indirectly. He does not witness the crash firsthand. His reaction is to turn inward, rejecting his friends, his life, his job. He is completely focused inward, where Brás, being suggested by Anna, should focus outward. Jorge has forgotten the lessons he tried to teach Brás in chapter 1, and declares that nothing in his life really matters, and that he has all been wasting his time. This inward turn for Moon and Ba, our authors, is something they view and present to you as self-destructive. Right? We should read Jorge's articulation of why his life sucks as empty. As you see in the one here, he says, I thought I had a great life, great job, fun with chicks, but nothing in my life is extraordinary. Nothing in my life really matters. Life is too short, man. I've been wasting time. I can't go back to that life. This is a rejection of the life Jorge has created. It's a rejection of his friends. It is a rejection of everything that he felt valuable. We will see in later chapters that these comments about how Jorge will go and find something to do with his life are empty, and that Jorge doesn't do this. Instead, this nihilism and dissatisfaction with life only continues to develop and grow deeper. And we pick this up in chapter 7. Chapter 7 continues on from chapter 6, where we have a sense of Jorge missing, and Brás learns finally where his friend is. This is probably the most gruesome chapter in the book, and ends with Jorge killing Brás in a murder-suicide. This murder-suicide and Jorge's whole presentation and character in chapter 7 is a presentation of what Freud would call the death drive, the Thanatos drive. Moon and Ba, I think, are quite explicitly presenting Jorge as a character who is caught in this death drive. So essentially, a death drive is the drive to die for self-harm and self-destruction in order to have some control over your own life. As Freud says, the instinct is then called the destructive instinct, the instinct for mastery or the will to power. Think of it this way. The only thing that Jorge can do in chapter 7 is end his life. For him, all other attempts to change his life, to pull out of that spiral, would have to involve chance. He would have to give up his own control. But throughout this chapter, we are told that Jorge prefers to have control over his destiny and over his life, even if the only control he has is a self-destructive control. So, the theme of the death drive. Freud believed that humans would always be driven towards pleasure as our sort of base normal instinct. And if we think about pleasure here, we think of an absence of pain. Yet, he needed to understand how people would commit suicide or engage in reckless, self-destructive behavior. If he believed that everyone works to avoid pain, why would some people actively seek to commit pain on themselves? So his attempt to understand this, he created this concept of the death drive, which is a desire to control life, even if that control leads to death. So in terms of the Daytripper, in terms of Moon and Ba, we can see the death drive as a reaction to trauma that essentially turns inward, building on destructive impulses because those are the only things that Jorge, for example, can control. So, to explain further, according to Sigmund Freud, humans have a life instinct. This is this desire to avoid pain, and a death drive, which is commonly called, although Freud did not call this himself. This death drive compels humans to engage in risky and self-destructive acts that could lead to their own death. Behaviors such as thrill-seeking, aggression, and risk-taking are viewed as actions which stem from this Thanatos instinct from the death drive. Here's kind of a cute and funny chart that gives you the two types of reactions that people have. The eros, or the life instinct, which is considered our normal instinct, has a desire to lead us for procreation, social cooperation, and survival. The Thanatos, or death instinct, leads to aggression, risky behavior, and reliving trauma. On these two columns, we could place Brás as a life instinct, who, in his reaction to the trauma, moves towards survival and moves towards social cooperation, sees his life in helping others by writing the obituary as something that could heal him and help him move past witnessing the trauma of the plane crash. Jorge, however, ticks off all three of the Thanatos death instincts. He is caught reliving the trauma of almost being on the plane that died. He engages in risky and self-destructive behavior. And as we see in this chapter, he has a very aggressive nature. So let's look at how these two approaches, the death drive and the eros drive, play out in the chapter. Similar to his reactions in the last chapter, Brás here is still thinking about his friend. He still has a desire to help his friend. As he says in the panels presented here, he has not given up on him, And even though we all fall down, Brás hopes that one day he could help Jorge get up. In many ways, this is an idea that Jorge himself once embraced. In the flashback panel presented below, Jorge claims that if it weren't for people, life would be a fucking desert. Note how this idea connects back to Benedito's speech about the city as a desert in chapter 3. So essentially we have Brás here as someone who has learned the lesson. Brás has become more defined. He's become more embraced in a communal sense of himself and finding peace and friendship with others. Jorge, however, from this panel presented to you here, has lost his definition. He has completely fallen inward in his reaction to trauma. So, Ana tries to explain this to Brás. Ana tries to explain to Brás that Jorge has spiraled down in a death drive that has rejected his life and the lives of his friends. She tells Brás that Jorge doesn't want to be found, that he gave up. This shows that Jorge's reaction to the flight and the plane crash was not seen as a way to find a new life, but was instead his way to give up on life. His comments last chapter about trying to do something with his life, to do something that matters, to do something that was extraordinary, have all been proven to be false. What Jorge wanted to do was to give up on life. And by giving up on life, for him, it found a way to control life. By rejecting the chance to do anything, it at least allows him some control over his existence. And this is what is driving Jorge's death drive to its inevitable conclusion that we see at the end of the chapter. So let's move to the meeting between Brás and Jorge. As Brás searches for Jorge, he learns that upon his initial arrival to the village, he was popular. Although he did not work, he talked to everyone. He was well respected by the regulars at the hotel and the bar. However, eventually he runs out of money and refuses to work. Right? If you remember, he was offered work at the hotel. He rejects it. Right? Eventually, he is forced to leave the hotel and takes up residence in an abandoned hut at the edge of town, which then he moves further into the desert. Jorge here, in this story that Brás learns, is focusing only on his death drive. He's not taking opportunity to engage other people fully. He's not trying to grow and develop his life. Instead, he is becoming further withdrawn because withdrawing is the only act that he can control. So the story of Jorge's descent easily lends itself to a variety of problems and makes him a metaphor for the death drive. So Jorge's change is purposely left unclear. We see that he was obviously and understandably freaked out about possibly being on the plane that crashed, but it's hard to see how someone that we've seen elsewhere in the chapter always be presented as someone who is friendly and interested and full of life become so ragged, become so distressed. And I think what this points us to is that very often the specific causes of people going into a death drive is unclear and maybe not even as important. One person can react and develop a death drive impulse. Someone else cannot react to that very same notion of trauma. Instead, Moon and Ba want us to focus on the compulsion to control that is driving Jorge's reckless and deadly behavior. The murder scene, which some students are confused, flips between a flashback of the murder, as pictured here on page 173, and also a flashback of Brás and Jorge in better times. This has a clear marker of the death drive. If you notice from the panels presented on this PowerPoint, you will see that Jorge is attempting to commit suicide. This is what he cannot do without Brás there to help him. Right? Essentially, he feels he might not have the strength, but once Brás is there, he feels he is able to commit the deed and kill himself. However, it is only after Brás attempts to stop him that Jorge becomes sort of enraged and murders his friend. So what the panels present to you very clearly here, if we see, moving from left to right, that Jorge would most likely kill himself, but Brás, who goes to stop him, is what eventually causes Jorge to attack Brás in sort of retaliation for this act. So, what these two chapters present to us, chapter 6 and 7, they present the idea that a death drive reaction to trauma, an inward turn for mastery and control, is unhealthy. For Moon and Ba, a rejection of life and rejection and turn towards nihilism is the key to self-despair, and it is the wrong way to understand life. At the end of his character arc, Jorge is a metaphor for the death drive and then becomes a sort of negative lesson for you, the reader. Right? Jorge is a metaphor for how not to understand the relationship between death and life. Jorge's death is the worst response to death presented in the entire book. It is a negative model that Moon and Ba do not want you to take. Instead, they would prefer you to act, and the reader to act, like Brás was in the previous chapter, turning towards others, turning towards friends and family. And it is only through there that the possible of healing and moving past death can exist. So if one of the things you want to take from these two chapters is how Brás's friend Jorge becomes an example for the worst attitude and approach towards death, to see death as a release, to see death as something that stops life, is a completely antithetical approach for Moon and Ba, who want you to see death embedded in life, in a grander process of natural rebirth and growth. Jorge's decision here is presented as a selfless decision, not just because he also murders his friend, but because it shows an understanding of what death is, and his complete rejection and a negative model for the entire thematic approach towards death that Moon and Ba, as our authors, want us as readers to understand. So, for the next chapter, pay attention to how Anna is given a choice to go either towards Brás's or Jorge's way to respond to death, and see how it compares here. If Jorge is a negative model, see how in the next chapter, Anna might be presented a more positive way to deal with grief, trauma, and death. We will discuss that reaction later in a future video lecture.